300 million years ago, there was no Africa, Asia, Americas, or Europe. Just one big supercontinent, Pangea. And today, there is still a force connecting those divided by distance, reversing millions of years of rifting. Making far feel close, bringing there to here. Turkish Airlines.
You are watching In Conversation This Week with Miceal O'Hurley.
I'm Miceal O'Hurley, and welcome to In Conversation This Week. Today, we turn our sights to the issue of Crimean Tatars, and in particular, the women of the Crimean Tatar community. Join us as I welcome a distinguished panel of women to discuss an exciting study into the views and opinions concerning Crimean Tatar women, all within the context of Ukrainian women playing an equally critical role in the defense of their nation and that of European security and the rule of law. Maybe for the first time in history, women don't have to prove themselves. They're doing it daily. Today, I welcome Ayla Bakkalli, the Crimean Tatar representative for Indigenous people at the United Nations. Mavilie Demirdzhaieva, another Crimean Tatar youth activist who has already served internships in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and the all-important Committee for European Integration at the Verkhovna Rada. Roxolana Weinar, who received her education at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, a well-known human rights activist and society actor. Welcome to her today. And we have Martha Kirchowska-Caballo, whose doctorate in cultural anthropology from the Graduate Center at CUNY, an upcoming publication on women's community citizenship commitment, Ukrainian diaspora, give her a deep insight into this work, and as a representative to the United Nations for the World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations. And lastly, we have our distinguished guest, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Her Excellency, Ms. Oksana Markarova. With such a distinguished panel, I'm sure you'll find this exciting. Stay tuned. Let's turn first to a guest we all know, a tireless advocate for the indigenous people of Crimea, the Crimean Tatars, Ukraine, and for women, Ms. Ayla Bakkalli. Ayla, how are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much.
I read your report, Beyond Borek, Crimean Tatar Women's Access to Empowerment Within Public Spaces. It's fascinating work. Let's start at the beginning. What is Borek, and tell me what brought you to delve into this subject?
Borek is very symbolic food. It is our traditional food, and it's also part of our identity with respect to our cuisine. And it's something, one part of our cuisine that has been maintained during exile and during different areas of the diaspora. And our grandparents, Mavile's grandparents, my mom and dad, and all our mothers and aunts knew how to cook Borek, and it's something that is very lengthy in time, and it's prepared during gatherings, during celebrations, and it's it has a very fine art of dough kneading layer by layer. It requires special oil, which is sunflower oil for crispy frying. So in that respect, it has transitioned into what we now identify as our main dish. It's equivalent to Ukrainian's borscht, which is absolutely gorgeous in color. Ours is a dough, and we love it. In summertime, we have it with compote or hoshaf, as we call it, and watermelon. And in winter time, we have it with yogurt. So it all depends, but it's simple recipe, but it's something that we love and we look forward to. It's a very Crimean Tatar.
When you talk about the different layers, it's evocative of Crimean Tatar life. Crimea is such a rich place of history, culture, faith, continuity. Its relationship as part and parcel of Ukraine. That idea of layers is really an interesting idea. So let me ask you, what brought you to dive into all of these layers of the experience of Crimean Tatar women? Who did you get to participate in this study? And do you think it's a sufficient pool of participants to give you insightful learnings that might affect change?
Thank you for that question. I love it. It's an excellent question. But actually, Michael, I have many reasons. But one reason in particular that I can share with you why I have selected Borek, because whenever we Crimean Tatars have a gathering in our community, in our association or buildings, we all gather together in unison with Crimean Tatar men and women. But when it comes times to Borek, the women and men segregate, and the women find themselves in the kitchen and the men are in the main salon area. So it is, it has that domesticity reference to it. And so I wanted to label that within a cultural context. Actually, I had originally labeled this survey as damsel in distress, but it was very far away from Crimean Tatar culture, but I brought it back within our culture. But with respect to this initiative of Crimean Tatar women's empowerment and parallel to that, the survey, I find that whatever I did, somehow I always landed in work involving Crimean Tatars issues. There was no escaping. It followed me, I followed it. Also, on another level, I also felt a need to be committed to who I am as a Crimean Tatar and as a woman who has a perspective, who has a vision on how I see things for my community. I was approached by our American Crimean Tatar diaspora community to head its association, and which I won the elections. I was also approached for the World Congress of Crimean Tatars, and etc. as a representative, as you notified of at the UN Permanent Forum. So in all these occasions, and I had numerous interactions within my community, here and afar. So I began to observe and witness myriad of dynamics, in particular of Crimean Tatar girls and women. I saw tremendous talent, tremendous ambition, and tremendous drive to succeed, not only within their own respective society, but as well as with our own respective communities. I saw leadership qualities in young Crimean Tatar girls to persevere, to conquer their challenges. However, having stated this, whenever we gather, there's and there is gathering within the community, somehow all this talent of young girls or women are relegated to go into the kitchen of that community, to serve tea, to serve Borek. And this was very troubling for me. And in all these ensuing years and all these ensuing conferences, the discussion on particular Crimean Tatar girls and women have slipped off the radar by the entire Crimean Tatar community throughout the years. And moreover, the many activities that we have taken place never brought to the forefront awareness of the concept of empowering these Crimean Tatar women within our community who are so talented. In other words, the issue of Crimean Tatar girls and women never took a stand-alone position or an issue. And the agenda of our organization also never was devoted specifically on Crimean Tatars women's issue. It was housekeeping, it was administration, it was what we're going to do, etc. So, as of last night, I started with 29. We have now reached 45 surveys in answer to your question. And the respondents to this survey revealed very interesting points that I want to express here. When I asked them about empowerment question, they always express their feelings and their issues, this is generally speaking, within a community concept. So they express themselves, their emotions through the community narrative. They did not express their viewpoints as an individual. They did not encapsulate those emotions as a woman. They did not integrate those two as an individual Crimean Tatar, and moreover, not even as an individual Crimean Tatar woman. So through the lens of the Crimean Tatar community is the context that I received. I always had to go back and say, no, it's about you. It's about you and your position. And Miceal, if I can just share a brief anecdote, when I talked about self-empowerment and individual identity, one respondent said, Ayla Hanım, I love my husband. So she, through her individuality, she felt that she would somehow be a barrier with her husband. I said, no, this is not at all. So it was quite telling, even at this early stage. The respondents were very honest. And so at this stage, it's qualitative analysis. And the qualitative analysis showed us that there is a void within the Crimean Tatar community. And that void is title of this report. Crimean Tatars women access to empowerment within the public space, within a gender equality context and content.
I find that fascinating. I want to pick up on a cultural similarity with the Irish. And you and I have talked about this before. The oldest human remains found in Ireland have been DNA sequenced. And where do they come from? Ukraine. We have a common ancestry. What's happening in Ukraine today is felt deeply by the Irish people. We experienced Angkor Timor, where the English, an imperial master, took our food and exported it while we starved by the millions. Angkor Timor even sounds like Holodomor, where the Ukrainian people's food was taken from them and they starved by the millions. And even 150 years later, this idea of the potato famine is nothing more than a narrative to mask the truth of that genocide. So when you talk about these things, Ayla, I immediately thought of the Irish issue being common to what the Crimean Tatar women reported in your study. In Ireland, our language is such as that we're non-possessive. We're not happy. The humor is upon us. You don't drink, the drink is upon you. So there's no sense of I own my emotions. I don't have to take responsibility for them. So when you say, that these women answered the questions within the context of culture or spousal relationship, it immediately struck me that even engaging in this dialogue is a critically important step in self-examination.
I feel that our discussion is more on that exploration level because it is the first time, and on your program and everyone here is addressing the issue of the individual Crimean Tatar woman within a gender context.
So let me ask you this quick question, because I know we have a lot of guests and I want to keep this moving. There was a particular question, and you asked whether Crimean Tatar girls, youth, and women, what they see as their greatest obstacles: economics, institutions, opportunities, and culture. And they almost all equally competed for what were the greatest obstacles. So as a very short final input from you, Ayla, what are your thoughts about those obstacles? Are they as insurmountable as these women think? Is this the beginning of the journey where they may not be able to look over the horizon yet? What are your thoughts about that answer?
Well, because I am a Crimean Tatar and because I am also a Crimean Tatar woman, so of course I understand where they launch their opinion from or their thinking from. And so the empowerment of the three challenges was it was a competing and almost exactly the same, that what are the three key challenges that hinder your empowerment as a Crimean Tatar youth? And it was between opportunity and cultural. So those two segments were competing. They did not feel economic hindered their empowerment, which means they understood the question perfectly in this one. And they did not think of it as an institutional. So they looked at it as an opportunity. And this equal standing with opportunity and culture is something now that I know I will need to look very closely into. And the objective is to have 100 respondents, but you were very intelligent in your remark in the fact that we are discussing it, and in itself is a process, because when I did have a Zoom with one youth, she absolutely froze on some of the questions. So what that tells us, and for this report in particular, is that is the area we need to focus and see how we can find a resolution for those two particular hindrances.
Mavilie, you're a Crimean Tatar woman, are you not?
Yes, I am.
Did you ever think, as a young Crimean Tatar woman, that you would be invited into a conversation about empowerment? Was that always part of the zeitgeist of your life? Or is it surprising that we're here talking about this today before the world?
Thank you very much for your question, and I would also say that I'm very grateful for being a participant today at our today's session. Answering your question, I would say that no, I would never imagine that I will be asked that question, because it was I think it was not an issue for me or for my family, at least, because we thought that it is a normal way, a normal path for every woman, every girl to grow, to get an education, to get a job. And now, being a member of an organization which is working on the women empowerment in Ukraine without concretizing their work on the Crimean Tatar group, I see how many issues we have. There are a lot of gaps that we need to work on. By that I mean that this is the sphere of leadership, of advocating the rights, advocating the liberties, being change makers within the society and the community itself. So only now I can think about these problems, these issues that we need to deal with, and yes, I think that is very topical, very actual now. And we need to do everything to cooperate with the government, to cooperate with other institutions to solve these issues.
You've worked at the very centers of power in Ukraine, the Rada, the parliament, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Do you think there's enough understanding of the context of empowerment for the Crimean Tatar women within the greater context of empowerment of Ukrainian women? What more needs to be done? And do you think the government is committed to addressing these issues?
Thank you again for the question. I would like to emphasize that I had an internship in separate units, separate divisions of either the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine or the Verkhovna Rada, the Parliament of Ukraine. And each of them had their own agenda and a list of issues they were dealing with, so to speak. If we talk about the last body, the Parliament Committee on European Integration, where I spent more time as an intern, then I must admit that it was mainly engaged with holding various meetings related to the advancement of our country in the direction of European and Euro-Atlantic integration. I was directly involved in the preparation of documents in these meetings in which the subject of the occupation of Crimea and abuse of Crimean Tatars was raised. There is a separate subdivision of the Verkhovna Rada, the Committee of Ukraine on Human Rights, National Minorities, and International Relations, which deals directly with the observance of human rights and freedoms on the territory of Ukraine, ethno-national politics, international relations, and the rights of indigenous people and national minorities in Ukraine. It was worth noting that this body included or includes representatives of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, the representative body of our community, people's deputies of Ukraine, who monitor and constantly actualize the problem of the Crimean Tatar people, and as you said, the issues that confront the indigenous people in Crimea. I cannot unanimously say that the representatives of our people are not given attention because, for example, I constantly hear how the Majlis and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine cooperate for the liberation of Crimean Tatars, Crimean Tatar women and girls from Syria, their families from Syria, or giving their support in other countries, for example, now in Turkey. Therefore, I can say that at least these bodies are aware of the difficulties faced by Crimean Tatars and are open to solving them. Of course, we always want to have a closer cooperation, but I'm sure that this will be a relevant direction to work on in the future.
I was at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum in March, and I ran into Mustafa Zhemilev. Mustafa Aga has been a great advocate for the Crimean people and for Ukraine. And one of the issues that arose in the sideline discussions was the issue of women. So I am pleased to hear that you also find that that resonates in the parliament. I want to ask you, if I can, as a Crimean Tatar woman, as a Ukrainian woman, as a European woman, do you get the sense that Europeans understand the advanced understanding Ukrainian Crimean Tatar women have of themselves? I think back to a conversation I had with a foreign affairs minister in Europe who said, listen, Ukrainians, they're not very European. They don't respect women's rights. And I shared with him the story of Yaroslav the Wise, his daughter Anna, when she went to the French court almost 1,000 years ago. She was the only literate person in the entire French court. Ukrainian women have been a force of nature since the founding of the state and since the Crimean Tatars arose as the indigenous people on the peninsula. Do you think Europeans see you as equals and understand that empowerment in Ukraine isn't foreign, but rather something that is in continual development as it is to the rest of the West?
Very interesting question. I would say that as for now, they know not so much about the Crimean Tatars itself. So I have to say, they only during these 8 years started to understand where is Ukraine, what are Ukrainians, and what's the difference between Russians and Ukrainians. That is the most important issue. And only after starting understanding that, after getting acquaintance with the representatives of Ukrainians, of the Crimean Tatars, they started to know that yes, we have some questions, we have some issues related to the empowerment, to the gender equality, but in some spheres we went ahead of them. Here I can say about them Shefika Gasprinska. She's a real woman and an advocate of the Crimean Tatar women's rights, and she was a prominent person in our history. She was the first woman to introduce the women magazine into the Muslim world. At that time, our historical period. So it was amazing, and this is an example of my words that I said earlier.
I want to ask my last question to you before we move on.
Yeah.
As I talk to Crimean Tatar men and women in Crimea, in the diaspora, in Turkey, and those who are now resident in the United States and Canada and elsewhere, one of the questions is, can Crimean Tatar women become empowered without losing their identity as Crimean Tatar women within the context of Islam? There's a lot to unpack there, but do you see the empowerment of women as being in tension with being a Crimean Tatar woman or complementary?
I would say that empowerment will be complementary to the Crimean Tatar woman, because throughout the history, despite all the challenges that we faced our women, the world war, the being sent to the Central Asia and the current occupation of Crimea, they always tried to get an education and job. That I say, looking back at my mom, at my aunts, at my grandmother, who, despite all the challenges, they entered the universities, they got their certificates, and it was hard to find a job, but they did. So it was on the same way with getting their rights in the Soviet community, among with other people. So it is the parallel processes. I mean, so by getting these empowerment principles, as I said earlier, leadership, being advocates of their rights, and change makers.
Roxolana, I know the ambassador will be joining us shortly. I'd like to go to you before she talks with us. You've studied Ukrainian migration patterns. How do you think that this war is similar to other mass displacements of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians? And how do you think it's different? And what do you think might be some of the consequences of Russia having unleashed this brutal warfare, which has caused millions of Ukrainians to flee for their safety? What do you get from this picture?
Well, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the question. I think it's a very important question, what you're saying. Actually, in May 18th of this year, it marked 78 years since it was around 1944, right, when Stalin deported many Crimean Tatars from Ukraine into concentration camps. It was around, I think, 200,000 or so. And unfortunately, so I'll talk about some of the similarities first, I guess. We've seen kind of a pattern with the 2014 invasion of Crimea, and now in 2022, on February 24th, this massive invasion of Ukraine and, ongoing occupation of Crimea by Russians. So there have been, right now, according to the UNHCR, there are more than 6.3 million Ukrainians, and I'm sure Tatars are included in that number, who have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries. And there's about 6.6 internally displaced peoples within Ukraine, and that also probably includes Crimean Tatars, because during the 8-year ongoing war since 2014, part of the IDP numbers that were in mainland Ukraine were 1.5 million at that time. Before this second massive war, there were a lot of Crimean Tatars in that number. And so, as we can see, the patterns of people being displaced because of Russians is similar, that they have to flee because they're being persecuted for different, for kind of similar reasons in a way, because of who they are. I mean, there's really no other reason why they're being displaced. It's like my own family were displaced as well from Ukraine, and in 1944 by Russians who invaded Western Ukraine. My family was in intelligentsia. They were educated, and they were considered as a threat to the Russian Empire that Stalin wanted to create. And so I'm assuming that also these patterns are kind of continuing today, but also just people are being targeted for no other reason than just being Ukrainian or Crimean Tatars. They're just being wiped off, basically, either murdered or sent to concentration camps, gulags, what they call now filtration camps, or they're just, being forced to flee. So we see these similarities both in World War II, probably World War I, and today, where people are just being displaced from their homes. Perhaps the tactics are a little bit different nowadays with the warfare. I mean, obviously, there's different forms of disinformation that's not helping the cause. There's levels of dehumanization going on that perhaps we're not seeing in such a wide scale level in World War I, World War II, especially World War II, because we didn't have the social media that we do now and the technology. So Russians can use different platforms to brainwash a larger amount of Russian troops and Russian people, and thinking that, what they're doing is a good thing by going into Ukraine and exterminating people. I mean, these are innocent people. As Ms. Ayla was saying, this is a completely senseless war that should have never begun in the first place. Same with 2014. There was absolutely no reason for Crimea to be invaded. There's no reason now for Ukraine to be further invaded since February 24th. So I think like the levels of Russians have always been masterminds of propaganda and misinformation and dehumanizing other people. And anyone who's ever been against them has been labeled either a terrorist or a Nazi. Those are just constants that have happened both in World War II and now. I know because even my own family and others who fled Ukraine were labeled as such. And all they wanted to do was live in Ukraine in a peaceful country, build their country. Their only crime was being Ukrainian and educated. And same thing with Crimean Tatars. I mean, their only crime is being Crimean Tatars, and most of them are very educated. I mean, the level of education in Ukraine and Crimea is very high. And these are people who just want to build their country. They just want to live in peace. They want to be in a democratic Ukraine, so to speak, and they're not being allowed to do that. And so I think it's just like similar patterns we're seeing, but just kind of being repackaged, instead of having the hammer and sickle that communists use, now we have the Z. But it's basically the same idea, that there's this extreme hatred, this extreme discrimination, whatever you may want to call it, racism towards Crimean Tatars, as well as towards other people living in Ukraine, Ukrainians themselves, that's being used by Russians to kind of justify what they're doing. And it's unfortunate that this is the largest amount of people fleeing from any European country since World War II. And it shouldn't be happening in 2022. It shouldn't be happening like this. And so, Russians also have gained a lot of, they have their war machines constantly being fueled by, different partners, so to speak, different, means like gas and oil that's fueling them. And, their technology is much more advanced than it was in World War II. So those are just kind of some of the things I've seen with similarities and differences.
I live in rural Ireland by the seaside. Of course, most of us in Ireland live by the seaside. We have 700 Ukrainian families in this small community. They're living under the EU Temporary Protection Directive. It's a very welcome move by the European Union. We're all thankful for it. It provides temporary security, but in tandem, it promises nothing but uncertainty. How long will it last? How will these people integrate? Will they be allowed to integrate? Many have decided to try to return to Ukraine. Some can't, some won't. Now we have the dynamics of the Russians occupying the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, stationing artillery within it, firing on Ukrainians, not maintaining it properly, and it threatens to be a second Chernobyl, which will impact all of Europe, and which drives more uncertainty about internal displacement, migration, and whether that will be temporary or permanent. As you discuss this topic with your colleagues, as you look at it within the context of history, do you see this temporary evacuee population returning to Ukraine when the victory comes, and comes it will? Or do you see them remaining outside of Ukraine and becoming part of a permanent diaspora?
That's a very interesting question, because in my own research, I did a master's thesis about something similar about my own family. So I looked at Ukrainians who were displaced during World War II, and I looked at the human rights and security implications. And I did research with Ukrainians who are living in the United States, Canada, and I also chose Argentina because I was curious to see, the commonalities and differences about how Ukrainians ended up in these countries and, how they remained there. I think with then and now in this case is a little bit different because back when my family was fleeing, unfortunately, well, they all assumed, and probably like now, that they would return home. I mean, I know my grandparents and even my mom always talked about how grandma and grandpa always said, like, we're going to come back. This is temporary. They thought they were fleeing to Europe temporarily. I mean, no refugee wants to leave forever. That's number one. Nobody even wants to leave their home, but they had no choice. It was either running away or being shot or taken to the concentration camps, the gulags in Siberia. So they were seen as a threat, to the communist regime. And so basically when they went through displaced person camps in Europe, whether it was in Germany or Austria, for example, then they were sent to wherever they could get sponsors and whichever country would take them in. And it was normally back then by what skills they had. So like my family ended up in the United States, others ended up in Australia, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and so forth. So as you know, we have different waves of Ukrainians that have lived in the diasporas because of different waves of persecution in Ukraine. And also there have been Ukrainians who left for other reasons throughout history, as farmers to try to make a better life, or for other economic opportunities overseas, maybe educational opportunities. So there have been different waves of migration patterns that I've researched. But right now, what seems interesting, what you're asking me about, like, for example, this population in Ireland, are they going to remain? That's to see, it's only going to be unfolding before us. It all depends on what happens with Ukraine. My own family is in Ukraine. I have a huge family there. They're out doing everything they can to help. They're even housing IDPs themselves, internally displaced people, as well as helping, a lot of doctors, a lot of training to fight on the front lines and so forth. And some of them are helping actual refugees go to Europe, to neighboring countries. A lot of these refugees say that they don't want to stay in Europe, that they would like to come back to Ukraine and rebuild it. However, I'm sure that depending on how long this second invasion lasts, it's going to be difficult for some people to return. Why I say that? Because as time goes on, people are going to establish their lives, right, in their new country. And hopefully these countries will extend these protections in the EU and elsewhere to help Ukrainians, to help Crimean Tatars who are seeking refuge and asylum there, because that's very important. But I think right now we see a little bit of a difference in also, I forgot to say this earlier, one of the differences is right now we're seeing a lot of women and children that are migrating out of the country, whereas in World War II it was entire families, like with men. But right now men are not allowed. So that's an important distinction I forgot to make. That's a big difference with the migration pattern. So maybe because it's women and children that have husbands or fathers or sons or whoever it is in Ukraine still, they may be more inclined to return because they want to be reunited with their male counterparts, so to speak, their male relative. So that might be an incentive for them to return, but also a lot of people just don't like to be displaced people. They don't want to have that title. They want to go back to Ukraine and rebuild it. But there might be others, who start studies in Europe, or they become, ingrained working there in, whatever capacity. So it's kind of hard to see, because in World War II, unfortunately, when my family left, they wanted to come back, but they weren't allowed to. If they came back, Ukraine didn't become independent until 1991. And unfortunately, people who left at that time period, some of them didn't survive till 1991 to come back. There were, however, their children, grandchildren who started coming back to Ukraine. So perhaps we'll see something similar with these migrational patterns. It's hard to say because history is kind of unfolding before us, but like, for example, I myself, I was born first generation in Colorado, but I have come to Ukraine many, many times, 16 plus times. I've lived in Ukraine, I've worked there, but because my mom is still in the United States, my father, unfortunately, has already passed away. I always come back to the US because, you know, I have my mom mainly. And and I have an established life because I grew up here. But so it, you know, it really depends on individuals. But I've had other people, for example, who have gone to Ukraine and completely gave up their American citizenship and have become Ukrainian citizens and have married people, for example, in Ukraine, and have kind of reassimilated into life in Ukraine. So I think it's just an interesting question that only time will tell. We'll see what happens. We'll see how many people end up staying. And it also depends on the benefits that they're getting as well. Can they survive off of that, what they're getting from the EU? I know already from talking to my volunteers on the ground who have been helping with humanitarian initiatives that a lot of Ukrainians who have already been displaced since February have been returning to Ukraine because they can't survive in countries like Poland, for example, Romania, Hungary. They're not getting enough benefits, unfortunately, or they just have been housed with many families, and that's really difficult for them. So they'd rather come back to Ukraine, even if it's in another part of Ukraine, and be internally displaced there, because at least they feel like they're still in their homeland and they feel like they can contribute. Plus, they have male relatives that they can visit when they have some rest, or like, sometimes they get permission to come back from the front lines and visit their relatives if they're in Ukraine. Obviously, they can't leave Ukraine without special permission. So, it'll be interesting to see, definitely. I think this is a very important question that will be ongoing, to see what will happen with Ukrainians, not only in Ireland, but anywhere in the world where they are right now.
One of the things that I've experienced in the last 40 years, covering 6 wars, I've had a lot of experience with displaced persons, refugees, evacuees. This is almost a unique situation because it's happening within the context of Europe. There are the temporary reliefs of fleeing to European borders, although it promises nothing but insecurity, even where there are benefits, like here in Ireland. Thank God the Irish government has extended a Céad Míle Fáilte, an Irish welcome. But when 5 families are living in a 2-bedroom home, the Russian propaganda narrative that the Ukrainians are living well off of social welfare, that they don't want to go back to Europe, or that if they were able to flee with their car, they somehow should feel shame that they once had a good life and still have a decent car, although they sleep in it from time to time. It's a very difficult situation for the temporary diaspora. The one thing that I would observe is that geography and modern transportation may be of assistance. But as my wife and I tell the Ukrainian community we assist, the job right now of the diaspora is to stay alive, to stay patriotic, and to nurture the language and culture in the community so that when they return, the children don't feel like foreigners in their own land. So, Roxolana, I'm sure we'll speak to each other again on the issues of migration and what this war has done, and the insecurity the Ukrainian community continues to live in with the uncertainties of a continually evolving war. I now want to turn to Martha. Martha, you're a cultural anthropologist. I've been itching to talk to you about this. I think back to World War II, not that I remember it personally, but we think about Rosie the Riveter, these empowered women, the WACs who flew advanced aircraft. Women stood to the forefront in every field, from agriculture to running large farms, to running industries, to manual labor in factories. After the war, they wanted to continue to live as empowered women, and yet there was some societal pushback about going back to the kitchen, which goes back to Ayla's title for this report. Give me some insights as to what you think this war has done in terms of creating opportunities for women and women seizing opportunities to be equals that may not have existed had the war not occurred?
Thank you very much, Michael, for that question. I'm very honored to be part of this discussion here. Yes, I think you're very right that women in general do step up to every crisis that is before them, and that once the crisis is over, a crisis of another kind of takes precedent in their own minds often. But that I think with the trend of gender equality, feminism, women's rights being an integral part of our own kind of global consciousness these days, that with each such crisis, something is not lost, and that I have full optimism for the integration of all of these values into Ukraine's future, and that women will not back off from the gains that they have made despite setbacks. There are major setbacks here, obviously, for a full generation of Ukrainian women, all citizens of Ukraine across the board. I want to say up front how honored I am to be with Ayla in this configuration right here, in this discussion. Ayla, I applaud you for the progress that you're making in your own quest for the empowerment of Crimean Tatar women, as we all choose to work together for our mutual empowerment in that vein. Ayla and I came to the World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations and my engagement in the non-governmental sphere of the United Nations from a background of a cultural anthropologist who had studied the Renaissance or the revival or the arising, anyway, the gelling of a new Ukrainian women's movement in post-Soviet Ukraine, focusing on an area of central Ukraine. And from that, and I took on the kind of a major role in that context in 2013, which was really just on the brink of the beginning of this 8-year war against Ukraine. And Ayla and I met at a big watershed moment in all of this. And the acquaintance with Ayla in the context of the invasion of Crimea and the struggle of the Crimean Tatars to establish themselves in the consciousness of Ukraine in general as integral to the democratic, the body democratic of Ukraine, and to work together as a spectrum of Ukrainian citizens in all of its, diversity and gender differences, etc. This was a very big thing for me. And Ayla, I'm very grateful to you for the path that we followed together. Of course, I thought that Crimean Tatar women were wonderful from the start. Ayla herself being a representative at the United Nations of her community's self-government. I was introduced to Crimean Tatar journalists who were exiled from Crimea, news anchor women, so many very prominent people in my mind. And of course, we've seen there are individuals of greatly integrated power, Emine Japara and others, who are making their mark in Ukraine and in Ukraine's psyche of this diversity of ours as Ukrainian citizens. Well, I'm an American citizen, but I'm speaking of my homeland that I hold very, very dear. But Ayla impressed upon me the importance, and as I felt also in my own field work in Ukraine, because when I did my field work in the early 2000s, the Ukrainian women's movement was still rather fragmented. There was a strong feminist branch to it. There was very little recognition of the feminist impulses that were being expressed in the rural areas, which is where I was focusing. But where I go by Gerda Lerner's kind of a definition of feminism, wherever there is a budding consciousness that you are being wronged or discriminated against because of your gender, that is the feminist movement. And I saw a lot of that in Ukraine. Just talk about Ukraine as a stateless nation for so long. The tendency to turn to community building really as the major effort in order to preserve national identity, collective identity, as well as just an ethnic identity, and to preserve that. And of course, the home becomes very important. The domestic sphere is very important for that. And if the circumstances in society allow, then community building structures outside of the home, which has been a very strong element in the Ukrainian women's movement and Ukrainian women's involvement on a community level, on a cooperative level, even though it was not a state, a state, but yet the community had a lot of structures that were put together by women. And I think this is what is happening across the board with a lot of our communities. And case in point, that women have always stepped up to the crisis and reached into whatever sphere was open to them for these structures building. After World War II, this is where the World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations comes in. It was created in 1948 in Philadelphia on the initiative of the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, of which I am a member, and the UNWLA exists in the United States since 1925 to consolidate the voice of an ethnic group and its women. On the initiative of the UNWLA, working together with DP women who were flowing into the DP camps in Germany. That was the partnership that created the World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations, because Ukrainian refugees were flooding into new countries. And they decided that because the borders would be closed, as Roxolana explained, that they could not return. And the diaspora was a very important arena to consolidate whatever advocacy powers there may be, and to also continue the sense of a community outside of the borders, the actual geographical borders of Ukraine then. And it is through this organization that since 1993, as an accredited non-governmental organization, we've been working to advocate and to explain Ukraine's position and to work for human rights and women's rights in very particular fashion within that sphere.
You made a very interesting observation about Ukraine being a non-state nation for many years. Whatever we have to say, and I alluded earlier to Anna, Yaroslav's daughter, who intellectualized the French court, and she was uniquely the first European. Before France was an entity, Ukraine sent a queen who brought the nation forward. So Ukraine's always been part of Europe. This idea that we're returning to Europe is a bit unique, but one thing can be said, that in its stateless form, Ukraine continued to exist because the women nurtured the culture, the soul of the nation. Now that Ukraine is a state and will remain a state, and we'll see its sovereign borders restored soon, we have that confidence. What role will women take in the rebuilding of Ukraine? And will the men who have witnessed the women lead from the front? When I was in Bucha and Irpin in March and April, everywhere I looked, there were women in uniform. The women who weren't in uniform were doing something constructive. Women have excelled in ways that, quite frankly, as a man, I would be proud to do. They have nothing left to prove. Men, my guess is, will accept the achievements of women. Do you think they'll be more likely to integrate women into power structures, remove glass ceilings and barriers, and create a more equitable society?
I am sure of it. Over the last 2 decades, Ukraine has made gender equality the cornerstone of its state policy. And with accelerating efficiency, has brought more and more women into very prominent positions in all spheres. So this is a great achievement. Ukraine will continue to value the input that women have made. As you say, women are everywhere in uniform. Women are also the underpinning of all of countless volunteer effort that is so evident in winning this war. Women are the underpinning of those volunteer initiatives. And women's volunteer initiatives were the stopgap that helped Ukraine in the very early weeks, say, of this particular renewed invasion, all out invasion of Ukraine, even before the international agencies got themselves organized and up and running and ready to help. It was the women who saved that. And this will not be forgotten. And you think of the experience that has put into women. Women have grabbed onto those opportunities, and they are showing themselves to be extremely capable in every particular sphere that you might think. And Ukraine appreciates it. So, and I think everyone does. This is not something that will be forgotten. Women will not be beaten back into any kind of, we'll see. We don't know what the future will hold. We don't know what the circumstances will allow, but I think that with each passing year, that consciousness is not going to dissipate, and that we'll be moving forward in every possible good way.
Well, I can assure you, Martha, it's not only Ukraine who appreciates what women have done. Those of us who understand the context in which this is happening, that Ukraine is fighting for European security, the rule of law in international relations, also recognize and understand what women have done. Which brings me to our next guest, Her Excellency, Ms. Oksana Markarova, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States. There are certain times in history in which humanity is particularly challenged. In just a few of those times, we have the right people in the right place. I don't think I'm overstepping the mark to say that, Your Excellency, you have been one of those people. You've walked the halls of power in resurrecting Ukraine's finances. In your earlier career, you've smashed glass ceilings and made sure that other women were lifted up. You didn't just create opportunities, you empowered women. And now, in one of the most important postings of diplomacy in the world, at a time of international crisis that goes well beyond Ukraine's concerns, you're leading from the front. Thank you for joining us. And I want to ask you, what do you think the future holds for women in Ukraine after this experience of 8 years of war?
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here with a great audience, and thank you for your kind words. Let me allow me to start by thanking Ayla Hanum, not only for this event, but for everything you are doing, because all of us women who are able to do something, who are brave enough or have opportunities to do something, we all stand on shoulders of so many women who did it before us, with us, for us. And I think the solidarity is so important. And also men, because it's such an important element of being able to succeed as a woman, is to have your partner, your husband, your father, your children, regardless of the gender, actually support you in this. So we can only do it all together. Now, everything that you have discussed, and since I joined, this fight for democracy and freedom in Ukraine for 190 days, but as you rightfully said, for not only 8 years, but for 400 years. It's a fight that Ukrainian nation, which is multinational, because Crimean Tatars, Jewish people of different nationalities are such an inseparable part of what is it to be Ukrainian, that we fought on this territory for years to govern in our own country. And it's truly amazing how after centuries of oppression, we managed to keep it in our core. And I think women are a very important part of that, because during the terrible genocides, Holocausts, deportation of Crimean Tatars, there was always women who, when the men and most active women were killed and oppressed, but there were always these women who quietly saved it, saved the language, saved the culture, saved the history, this resilience that the whole world is talking about is coming, of course, from all Ukrainians, but I would say primarily from Ukrainian women of different nationalities and different origins, who have it in them. Because in the times of, we see it now, today is the 1st of September, and the majority of children which are in Ukraine actually went to school, which is remarkable again, that even under the shells and fires, the focus was to prepare the schools for opening so that we can focus on this. So I believe the fight has in many places the female face. Our First Lady has been such a big, not just a typical First Lady, but essentially at the front of this fight. Also, we have one of the highest number of women in the military, in the defense forces. But the reconstruction and the support life, because again, it's of course the brave president and First Lady, the armed forces, but it's all 40 million of Ukrainians who are fighting in Ukraine. And it's also all the millions of Ukrainians outside who are fighting on their fronts. And the reconstruction will have a female face in Ukraine as well. So we have to also acknowledge that women and Crimean Tatar women, of course, are subject of additional war crimes. We saw it in Bucha, we saw it in Mariupol, we see it, unfortunately, in so many places which are under occupation, Russian occupations. They specifically target women. They use tortures and rapes and as instruments of war, specifically targeting that resilient part that keeps the Ukrainian spirit in their hands and hearts. So it's clear, I think, to everyone in Ukraine, and you probably noticed that in every speech of the president from day one, but actually he did it even before this phase of the war, he always did it. He always mentions both women and men in his speeches. He always addresses defenders and she-defenders. He always acknowledges the fact that it's all of us doing it together, and it means a lot. So when Ukraine ratified the Istanbul Convention, when Ukraine moved ahead and included a lot of gender issues into the legislation, I was very proud that when I was the Minister of Finance, we were one of the few countries in Europe that actually included the gender-oriented budgeting into our budgeting system, which sounds very boring, but this is what you have to do. Like, unless you have restrooms for girls in the boxing classes, you will not have the equality. They might want to do the boxing, but if there is only one shower there, they probably will not choose the boxing simply because they cannot do it in the comfortable way. So I believe there is a long road still ahead of us, even in countries where women do make up not only 50% or sometimes more than 50% of population, but also 50% of the decision making. it's a constant work in progress, like democracy. Again, I think what this war is showing us, that nobody is safe. You can be peaceful, you can be pro-democratic, you can be a country that says we do not pose this threat to anyone, and yet just being peaceful will not protect you from the aggression and from the attack. Similar, the democracy is something that you have to fight for when it's peaceful time. You have to constantly work on keeping it. Similar with gender equality. Of course, we will win. I have no doubt. We don't have any other option. It's just a question where and how many lives we will be able to save and not to lose before we win. But when we win, that's when the most difficult part will begin, not only with the reconstruction, not only with the psychological care that all of us will need, those that have been on the front lines and under occupation, and those who have not been, because we all live this horrible tragedy. But also a huge work will need to be done to continue fighting for democracy and for equality and equal rights, because this is what our brave men and women are dying for at the front lines right now. So it's our obligation to continue that fight when peace will return to Ukraine.
Ambassador, you spoke earlier about instilling or integrating feminist concepts into your budgeting and how that has practical outcomes. In a large way, Ukraine was one of the stronger nations in Europe because of its progress with women's empowerment, so that when the war did come, there was a greater acceptance of women taking leadership roles. You also spoke about children starting school today. Bobby Kennedy used to refer to this idea that while the present shouts, the future whispers. I continue to see your government not only tend to the war before them, the future shouting, but you hear the whispers of the future. You're educating your children. You're continuing to develop women. You're addressing issues of gender equality. Will we continue to see the Ukrainian government make advances with regards to women's empowerment, even though there's a war on, or will it fall to the side under the excuse of an emergency?
This is the priority for the president, and he keeps talking about it all the time. It's definitely a priority for everyone in the government that while we are fighting, we have to focus on getting as many people back in, and we understand that it means that we have to do this rapid recovery. And as we speak, Minister Chernyshov is with the visit here in Washington, D.C., meeting everyone, presenting actually our concept of this rapid recovery needs. And it's very, down to earth, effective things we have to do now to repair schools, provide for shelters, provide for healthcare and jobs, so that people can actually return now to the liberated areas and to other places, so that we can keep the talent from leaving the country. Because what we hear from Ukrainians, and it's more than 8 million now outside of Ukraine, primarily women with children, that they all would like to come back, that they all would like to return as soon as it's possible. The second part is women empowerment. Again, of course, our armed forces have increased almost up to 1 million, and we still have lines in the conscription post from the men. But it means that we women have to step up. That every time a man goes to a front line, of course, sometimes women too, but of course, predominantly we see men joining the fight, especially at the front lines. It means that a woman have to step up to fill in the position that needs to be filled inside. So we see female volunteers. We see sometimes, it's interesting to notice in the TV footage from our hospitals and from others, you see women in the screen. Sometimes you go for hours and you don't see men, because It's the female journalists taking interviews from female doctors, tending to children, and then you just notice that how many more women you notice in the picture, which is quite natural. And I think, this stepping up in times of emergency will actually, help so many women to see also what they're capable of. Because even during peaceful times, I mean, we all women here in the picture knows that sometimes it's not the glass ceiling, sometimes it's not the prohibition, sometimes it's us who are limiting us. Because we tend to think that it's up to us to take care of children, it's up to us to take care of everything else. And not all of us are fortunate, as I am, to have a husband and partner who's so supportive in so many ways. So sometimes we are self-limiting ourselves because we say, well, I shouldn't apply to be a minister or deputy minister because who's going to do this, And I think now in terms of emergency, so many women saw that they actually are capable of doing all of that and still taking care of the family, or that sometimes, there are additional responsibilities that children can and should have, and they're totally fine, and they're even more happy because they feel themselves part of the family even more when they learn how to do laundry themselves. And it's a very good practical skill to have to start with. But I think it's, again, to look at the silver lining in this horrible situation. Again, there is nothing good about the war. There is nothing good about the tragic times that we all are going through. And again, this is a trauma that we all will have to work for so many years, if not decades after that. But if anything good can come out of it, is that this amazing unity and stepping up of pretty much everyone will also show to all of us what is it that we're capable of doing, in addition to what we thought we're capable. And for women empowerment, there are going to be a lot of positive outcomes, because even if anyone would want to get women back to where they have been before this, it will not be possible, I can tell you. This force is unstoppable.
There are countless, as you said, almost 8 million Ukrainians living outside of Ukraine temporarily, predominantly women and children. What words of advice or encouragement do you have of those women that are away from home, but continue to consider themselves patriots? What invitation do you have to be part of the solution for the rebuilding that is now happening and will continue to happen, especially as the entire victory comes to realization?
Well, first, I want to say to everyone who's outside of Ukraine and everyone who's inside of Ukraine, because so many of us feel every day that we're not doing enough. And it's okay. And I just want to say that it's okay to be in Ukraine and doing everything that you can in Ukraine, but it's also okay not to be in Ukraine and saving your children and helping from the outside. And I think we all have to understand that everyone matters. And every assistance and participation and help is so valued by everyone in Ukraine. The second is there is so much everyone who's outside of Ukraine can do to help. From continue to teach your children to speak Ukrainian or Crimean Tatar or both or more languages. From helping everyone around you. So many women outside I know are organizing and together the kindergartens, or taking care of each other kids while they can work on some schedule, going to the rallies, talking to people where you are, whether it's Poland or Germany or the United States, talking to your neighbors, explaining to them, talking to them about the war in Ukraine, and raising the support in every community, which is very important because we have to stay the course. And we have to have, it's very difficult to keep the focus on something for a long time. And it has already been more than 6 months, and it has already been more than 8 months. And we all remember how quickly in 2015, the world has lost attention and interest. Not all of us, but it's the people's attention to it that moves the government all over the place. And we have to keep informing people what's going on, but also helping in all kinds of ways, getting online, joining whatever initiatives the embassies or the NGOs or local communities or diaspora have. There are so many initiatives at churches, mosques, cultural centers throughout the globe. Here in the United States, in the embassy and the consulate throughout the United States, our Ukraine house here in Washington, D.C., other Ukraine houses and cultural centers, different churches have truly became a home away from home, but also the places of actions. So if I can finish my words by asking everyone who did not go and join, just do that. Find time on weekends, find times on days after school, sign petitions to the local politicians. Just go with the Ukrainian flag. All of that counts. Be active, be social, and let's all stay together, because together we can do much more.
Ambassador, I know you have to go. One last question. You have largely been talking to a Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar community. Speak to the world for a minute, because Ukraine is not only fighting for its own survival, but for the values, the democracies, and Western civilization holds most dear. What invitation do you have to the world, particularly the women of the world, to support other Ukrainian women in this cause?
Thank you. You're absolutely right. This war is much bigger than Ukraine. And what happens in Ukraine now already has, but will have implications for the security, global security. If autocratic regime attacking a peaceful country, violating all the international laws, violating all the international rules and the statute of the United Nations that all of the countries put in place after the previous Great War, in order to prevent something like that to happen again. If they can do it, they can succeed, and they will not be punished for what they've done, then the whole global system of security is no longer working. So of course, it's existential for Ukraine, as I always say. We need to win, because this is the only way for us to exist as true Ukrainian democratic nation. We don't have the place that 40 million people can move, and we don't want to move. This is our land, this is our home. But if Putin and Russian Federation wins, it means that we will not be the last one, as we are not the first one. Let's remember all the crimes that were done against Georgia, Moldova, Syria, people on the streets of London, people who were on the board of MH17, and we can go on and on and on. This cycle of bullying violence have to stop. So everyone who believes in the same values, everyone who believes in democracy, I would even say wider, even people who do not believe in democracy, but believe in the fact that the borders should be sacred the way they are now, people who believe in territorial integrity and sovereignty, they have to stand united with us, and they have not only to say no to Russian Federation's aggression, but they have to do everything possible to stop it, to help us win, to help us bring them to justice, and also ultimately to see what do we all have to reform at the level of international organizations so we can actually prevent it from happening. Because this is the only war where the Security Council, UN Security Council member, a nuclear state, attacked a neighbor, but it's not the only war throughout the globe right now, when people are being killed, when women are being targeted, when children are being turned into soldiers or killed, and all these places in Africa, in Asia, in other parts of the world, we have to strive for peace everywhere. And it starts with winning this war, stopping this war, but also not resting after that, putting the emphasis on every place where women and children and peaceful civilians are suffering. So I think, it just to remind everyone that, it's much bigger than Ukraine. It will always be much bigger than Ukraine. And we all have to participate in this right cause so that we can show that democracy can not only deliver better to the people, but also can defend itself. It's a crucial notion for all of us.
Madam Ambassador, I want to thank you for your time. To all of the panelists today, it has been my honor to facilitate your dialogue, to share in my small way in your mighty work. I have listened to what you've all said. There's much to be learned. I remember standing in Maidan Square, being interviewed by Turkish television in March, and I was asked whether Ukraine could hold on. My answer was that for Ukraine, it is an existential issue, that if they stop fighting, Ukraine ceases to exist. It is up to Russia to return to the rule of international law, to observe the principles of humanity, to cease to target civilians, women, and children, and seek to resolve its differences around a boardroom table, not the dining table in someone's house that has been reduced to rubble. Women have played the most heroic, enduring, and energetic role in the defense of Ukraine, and indeed the defense of European security over the last 8 years. They deserve our support. We wish them well for their continued empowerment. We wish all the Ukrainian people and people of goodwill everywhere all success. Ayla, we look forward to your study. We wish you continued good research and hope that this will inform everyone in ways that makes a difference for women, for men, for families, and humanity everywhere. I'm Miceal O'Hurley with the European Diplomat, thanking our guest, wishing you well, and I have to say, giving my continued admiration to the people of Ukraine who fight for their survival, that democracy, and European civilization and security.
Thank you for excellent moderation and your kind words, but also for everything you write. We're reading it with great interest always.
Stay safe.